My name is Sarah. I used to think family meant having people who saw your worth even when the world couldn't. I was wrong. The words hit me like ice water on a summer day. You're always broke anyway. What would you know about money? Michael's laugh followed, sharp and casual, as if he'd just commented on the weather. We were standing by the grill at my aunt's backyard barbecue, the smell of charcoal and lighter fluid thick in the July air. Beer cans sweated in everyone's hands, and the sound of sizzling meat should have been comforting. Instead, it became the soundtrack to my humiliation. I felt every pair of eyes in that backyard find something else to look at. My aunt suddenly needed to check the potato salad. My siblings discovered urgent conversations about sports. Even my mother, who had always been my fiercest defender, found her phone fascinating enough to stare at for 30 seconds too long. The silence was worse than the words. It was agreement without speaking. It was the sound of a family deciding in real time that Michael had simply said what everyone else already knew. That I was the cautionary tale, the one who couldn't get it together, the relative they'd rather not talk about at their dinner parties. I forced my face into what I hoped looked like a smile and mumbled something about needing to help with the drinks. But my hands were shaking as I reached for the cooler, and I knew Michael saw it. I knew he enjoyed it. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes when we're sitting with our pain, it helps to know we're not sitting alone. That night, I drove home with the windows down, trying to let the summer air wash away the taste of shame that had settled in my mouth. But it clung to me like smoke. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every moment of that awful silence. Had I really become what they saw? The family charity case? The one who borrowed $20 and took 3 months to pay it back? Yes, I'd been through layoffs. Yes, I'd pieced together income from freelance writing gigs and part-time retail work. Yes, there had been months when I'd eaten ramen more days than I cared to count. But broke? That word felt too small, too dismissive of everything I'd been fighting for. Everything I'd been building in the quiet spaces they never bothered to see. I thought about the manuscript I'd been working on for 2 years. The one I wrote, in coffee shops during lunch breaks and at my kitchen table after midnight. I thought about the online courses I'd been taking, paid for with money I'd scraped together from returning bottles and skipping dinners out. I thought about the small business plan I'd been crafting, the one that kept me up at night with possibility instead of worry. But none of that mattered in the face of Michael's certainty, the family's silence, and my own inability to defend myself when it counted. The next family gathering was my nephew's birthday party 2 weeks later. I sent a card with $20 inside and stayed home. No one called to ask where I was. The week after that was my cousin Lisa's engagement party. I made an excuse about being sick. Again, no one followed up. It became a pattern. Polite declines, careful distances, the slow fade that happens when someone realizes they've been performing belonging instead of actually having it. My absence barely caused a ripple in their family waters. If anything, I suspected it made their gatherings more comfortable. One less chair to set, one less person to worry about offending with conversations about promotions and mortgages and vacation plans to places I couldn't afford to visit. In the quiet that followed, something unexpected happened. I started to hear myself think. Without the constant background noise of family expectations and family disappointments, without the weekly reminders of who I wasn't and what I didn't have, I found space to focus on who I might become. I stopped checking their social media posts about Sunday dinners I wasn't invited to. I stopped crafting careful responses to the family group chat that had somehow become less active after I stopped participating. I worked with a focus I'd never had before. Not the scattered, desperate work of someone trying to keep their head above water, but the methodical, purposeful work of someone building something that would last. I found Margaret. Margaret was 73 years old and had been managing money longer than I'd been alive. She'd started as a secretary at an investment firm in 1972 and worked her way up through decades when women weren't supposed to understand numbers the way men did. She wore pearls with everything and never raised her voice. But when she talked about compound interest and risk assessment, grown men took notes. I met her at a financial literacy workshop at the community college. I was there because the $25 fee was the most I could afford to invest in my education that month. She was there because she volunteered her time teaching people like me. People who had more questions than capital, more hunger than connections. Most people think investing is about having money, she told our small group that first night. But really, it's about having patience. And most rich people got that way because they understood that being underestimated is an advantage, not a handicap. I stayed after class to ask questions. Then I stayed after the next class, and the one after that. Margaret began meeting with me on Saturdays at a diner near her house, where she'd order black coffee, and I'd order the cheapest thing on the menu, and she'd teach me to read financial statements like stories with hidden meanings. Every number tells you something about the person behind it, she'd say, pointing to a balance sheet with her perfectly manicured finger. But you have to know what questions to ask. I learned to ask questions. I learned to spot the difference. Between confidence and competence, between big talk and solid foundations, I learned that some of the wealthiest people she knew drove 10-year-old cars and shopped at discount grocery stores, while some of the brokest people she knew posted pictures of expensive dinners on social media every weekend. After 6 months of Saturday morning lessons, Margaret helped me get certified as a financial consultant. Not the kind who managed million-dollar portfolios, but the kind who helped small business owners understand their cash flow and taught young couples how to buy their first homes without drowning in debt. My first clients were people like me, people who'd been told they didn't know enough, weren't smart enough, didn't have enough. People who'd been made to feel small by family members who equated worth with wealth. I understood their shame because I'd lived it. I understood their hunger because it matched my own. The work was slow at first. I met clients in coffee shops and library conference rooms. I charged less than I should have because I needed the experience more than the money. But gradually, quietly, I built something that felt like mine. I learned to live on less so I could invest more. Not in stocks or bonds, but in knowledge and relationships, and the kind of slow, steady growth that doesn't make headlines, but makes differences. I read every financial book the library had, twice. I attended every free workshop and webinar I could find. I joined online communities where people shared strategies for building wealth without starting wealth. Margaret introduced me to other professionals who took chances on people like me, the ones who looked hungry instead of polished, who asked smart questions instead of impressive ones. Through them, I found my way to Sterling & Associates, a mid-sized investment firm that valued substance over style. They hired me not despite my background, but because of it. We need someone who understands what it's like to stretch a dollar, the managing partner told me during my interview. Someone who won't judge our clients for not knowing what they don't know. I worked there for 2 years, learning the business from the inside out. I discovered I had a gift for seeing risks that others missed, for asking the uncomfortable questions that needed asking. My colleagues began coming to me for second opinions on deals that looked too good to be true. Usually they were. When I finally left to start my own consulting practice, I took with me not just knowledge and connections, but confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from surviving your own worst fears and discovering they weren't as powerful as you'd thought. 3 years after that barbecue, 3 years after Michael's words had cut me down to size, I was sitting in my own office in a building downtown. Not a huge office, not a prestigious address, but mine. My nameplate on the door, my certificates on the wall, my phone ringing, with calls from clients who trusted me with their futures. I never posted about it on social media. I never sent updates to the family group chat that I'd long since muted. I liked the privacy of my success, the way it belonged entirely to me without needing anyone else's validation or approval. I liked being underestimated. It gave me room to move, room to grow, room to become someone they'd never expected me to be. What they didn't see were the 2 a.m. spreadsheets, the careful calculations that let me reinvest every spare dollar back into my business. What they didn't hear were the late-night phone calls with clients who'd been turned down by bigger firms, the quiet conversations over coffee with small business owners who needed someone to believe in their dreams before they could afford to pay for advice. What they couldn't know was how their dismissal had become my fuel, how their silence had become my focus, how their low expectations had become my freedom to exceed every one of them without having to explain myself along the way. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October, 3.5 years after that barbecue. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on my door. "There's a Sean Morrison from First National Bank on line 2, she said. "He's asking for a consultation on a commercial loan." I took the call, expecting another routine request. Banks often brought me in when they needed a second opinion on risky investments or borrowers with complicated financial histories. My reputation for thorough analysis had spread through the local banking community, and I'd become known as someone who could spot problems others missed. "Ms. Patterson," Sean's voice was professional but warm. "I have a client applying for a mid-sized commercial loan to expand his consulting business. The application looks solid on paper, but something feels off about the projections. Would you be available to review the file?" "Of course," I said, pulling up my calendar. "What's the timeline?" "Next week would be ideal. The client is eager to move forward, but I want to make sure we're not missing anything. His name is Michael Harrison. He's in business consulting, claims to have several major contracts lined up." My pen stopped moving across the paper. Michael Harrison. My cousin Michael. "Ms. Patterson? Are you still there?" "Yes," I managed, my voice steady despite the sudden racing of my heart. "I'm here. Next week works fine." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my office, staring out the window at the city skyline. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Michael, who had dismissed me as someone who knew nothing about money, was now unknowingly dependent on my approval for his business dreams. I could have declined the consultation. I could have cited a conflict of interest and recommended another consultant. It would have been the safe choice, the clean choice. But something in me wanted to see his file, wanted to understand what kind of business plan the man who'd humiliated me had put together. The following Tuesday, I sat across from Sean Morrison in First National's conference room. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of earnest energy that suggested he genuinely cared about making good loans rather than just hitting quotas. "Here's what we have," he said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany table. "Mr. Harrison is requesting $200,000 to expand his consulting practice. He claims to have contracts worth over $500,000 lined up, but when I asked for documentation, he provided letters of intent rather than signed agreements." I opened the folder and there it was, Michael's loan application, complete with financial statements, business plan, and personal references. His photo was paper-clipped. To the first page, the same confident smile I remembered from family gatherings, the same smile that had delivered those cutting words 3 years ago. As I read through his application, I felt a familiar analytical calm settle over me. This was what I did. I looked at numbers and found the truth hidden between the lines. And Michael's numbers were telling a story he probably didn't intend. His business plan was ambitious but vague, full of buzzwords and projections that didn't align with his actual track record. He claimed to have grown his revenue by 300% over the past 2 years, but his tax returns told a different story. His monthly expenses were higher than his reported income, and his personal debt-to-income ratio was concerning. "What's your gut feeling about this?" I asked Sean, still reading. "Something doesn't add up," he admitted. "He presents well, very confident, talks a good game. But when I dig into the details, everything feels inflated, like he's trying to sell me on an image rather than a business." I knew that feeling. I'd lived on the receiving end of Michael's image management for years. He'd always been good at making himself look successful. at talking about his achievements in ways that made them sound bigger than they were. But I'd never seen the numbers behind the presentation. "These letters of intent," I said, pointing to a section of his file. "Did you verify them?" I called 2 of the companies. One said they'd had preliminary discussions with Mr. Harrison, but nothing concrete. The other had never heard of him. I closed the folder and looked at Sean. "In my professional opinion, this loan represents a significant risk. The projections are unrealistic. The supporting documentation is insufficient, and the borrower's current financial position doesn't support the level of expansion he's proposing." Sean nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of. But he's been very persistent, keeps asking if there's anything else he can provide, anyone else he can talk to." "My recommendation is to decline the application," I said. "If he wants to reapply, in the future, with more realistic projections and solid contracts, that's different. But based on what I see here, approving this loan would be doing him a disservice, as much as the bank." 2 days later, my phone rang. I saw Michael's name on the caller ID and let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, his voice was strained, missing its usual confident edge. "Hey Sarah, it's Michael. I don't know if you've heard, but I'm dealing with some business stuff right now. First National turned down my loan application, and I'm trying to figure out why. I know it's been a while since we talked, but I was wondering if you might know anyone in the banking world who could help me out. Maybe put in a good word or give me some advice on what went wrong. I'd really appreciate it if you could call me back." I saved the message but didn't return the call. A week later, another message. "Sarah, I'm not sure if you got my last message, but I'm really in a bind here. This loan was supposed to help me land some major contracts, and without it, I might lose everything I've built. I know we're family, and I know you understand what it's like to struggle financially. Maybe we could meet for coffee and you could help me figure out my next steps." The irony of that last line, "You understand what it's like to struggle financially," wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, that struggle had been ammunition for his cruelty. Now it was something he hoped might make me sympathetic to his cause. I deleted the message without responding. The 3rd call came 2 weeks later, and this time I answered. "Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you." "I know," I said simply. "Look, I'm not going to pretend things haven't been weird between us lately. I know you've been distant from the family, and maybe I said some things that didn't come out right, but right now I really need help, and you're the only person I know who might understand the banking world." "What makes you think I understand?" "Banking?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how he'd rationalize seeking help from someone he'd deemed financially incompetent. "Well, I mean, you've been through financial struggles, right? You know what it's like when money gets tight. I figured you might have learned some things along the way, developed some connections." He still couldn't say it directly. He still couldn't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, I might have built something worth respecting. Even in his desperation, he was casting me as the recipient of charity rather than the giver of expertise. "Michael," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I can't help you. But Sarah, we're family. And I know I might have been insensitive sometimes in the past, but that doesn't mean we can't help each other now. I'm talking about possibly losing my house, my business, everything." The silence stretched between us. I thought about that barbecue, about the laughter that had followed his words, about the family that had watched me absorb his cruelty without saying a word in my defense. I thought about the 3 years I'd spent building something real, while he'd apparently been building something that looked impressive but couldn't survive scrutiny. "I understand you're in a difficult position," I said finally. "But I can't help you with this." "Why not? What's it going to cost you to make a phone call?" "It's not about cost, Michael. It's about competence. You said it yourself. I don't know anything about money, remember?" The silence on his end was different now. It was the silence of recognition, of chickens coming home to roost. "Sarah, come on. That was just family joking around. You know I didn't mean anything serious by it. The thing about jokes, I said, is that they're only funny if everyone's laughing. I wasn't laughing that day, and I'm not laughing now. I hung up before he could respond. 3 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. My youngest cousin was getting married, and apparently the family had decided to extend an olive branch. The invitation was addressed to Sarah Patterson and guest, which told me they'd at least bothered to learn my last name, though they'd apparently forgotten I'd been single for the past 4 years. I RSVP'd that I wouldn't be attending, but I sent a generous gift. More generous than I would have been able to afford 3 years ago. More generous than anyone in my family probably expected from the broke cousin. 2 weeks after the wedding, my mother called. "Sarah, honey, I know you've been keeping to yourself lately, but people are starting to ask questions. Lisa's wedding is coming up, and your absence is getting noticed." "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Well, people are wondering if you're okay, if maybe you're going through something difficult. And after Michael mentioned that you couldn't help him with his business situation, some people are worried that maybe you're dealing with your own financial problems." I almost laughed. Michael had apparently told the family about asking me for help, but he'd framed it as my inability to assist rather than my choice not to. Even in his failure, he'd found a way to preserve his image at my expense. "I'm fine. Mom. Better than fine, actually." "Well, that's good to hear. But maybe it would be nice if you came to one of these gatherings just to show everyone that you're doing well. You know how families worry." "Do they?" I asked. "Do they really worry? Or do they just want to confirm what they already believe?" "Sarah, that's not fair. We're all family here." "Family," I repeated. "Right." I didn't go to Lisa's wedding either. Instead, I spent that Saturday in my office, working on a new project that had the potential to double my business over the next year. I'd been asked to consult on a series of municipal bond investments, the kind of high-profile work that established reputations and opened doors. 6 months later, my success had grown to the point where I needed to hire additional staff. I was featured in a local business magazine article about emerging financial consultants, and my client list had grown to include several prominent local businesses and a handful of wealthy individuals who valued discretion over flash. I never sent the article to my family. I never posted about my achievements on social media. I never called to share my good news or invite them to celebrate my successes. I'd learned to find satisfaction in the work itself, in the quiet pride of building something substantial and lasting. But news travels in small professional communities, and apparently it had reached First National Bank. Sean Morrison called me again, this time with a different kind of request. "Ms. Patterson, I wanted to thank you for your analysis on the Harrison loan. You were absolutely right. He defaulted on his other debts within 6 months of our denial. Your insight saved the bank from a significant loss." "I'm glad I could help," I said. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. We're looking to expand our consulting relationships, and your name keeps coming up in our discussions. Would you be interested in a more formal arrangement with First National?" The contract they offered was substantial, a retainer agreement that would provide steady income while allowing me to maintain my independent practice. It was the kind of opportunity that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago, when I was the family cautionary tale who didn't know anything about money. Signed the contract on a Tuesday afternoon in March, exactly 4 years after that barbecue. As I walked out of the bank, I passed a familiar figure in the lobby. Michael was sitting in one of the leather chairs, looking older and more tired than I remembered, clutching a folder that probably contained another loan application. He looked up as I passed, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw recognition there, and something else. A question, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. But I didn't stop to find out. Some conversations are earned through years of respect and kindness. Some relationships are built on foundations of mutual regard and shared growth. Michael and I had never had those things, and his current desperation couldn't retroactively create them. I walked past him and out into the spring afternoon, where my car was parked in a spot marked, "Reserved for consulting partners." The sun was warm on my face, and I had 3 client meetings scheduled for the rest of the day. People who valued my expertise, who paid for my insights, who had never questioned my competence or my worth. That evening, I received a text from my mother. "Saw your name in the business section of the paper. Very impressive. Maybe we could have lunch soon." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Some invitations come too late, after the person has already learned to dine alone. Some acknowledgments arrive only after they're no longer needed, when the silence has already taught you everything you needed to know about where you stand. I had built something beautiful in that silence, a life that belonged entirely to me, success that no one could diminish because no one had been there to witness its creation. I had learned that being underestimated was indeed an advantage, that being dismissed was a kind of freedom, that being forgotten was sometimes the greatest gift family could give. Michael never knew that I was the consultant who had reviewed his loan application. He never knew that his words at that barbecue had been the catalyst for everything I'd built since. He never knew that his casual cruelty had become my quiet fuel, that his certainty about my limitations had freed me to discover capabilities I'd never known I possessed. And I liked it that way. Some stories don't need telling. Some justice doesn't need announcing. Some victories are sweetest when they're private, when they belong entirely to the person who earned them through years of patient work and careful growth. They had deleted my name from their group chats, forgotten to save my seat at their tables, dismissed my worth with laughter and silence. But they could never delete me from my own story, and in that story, I had learned to be both the author and the hero, the one who fell and the one who rose, the one who was underestimated and the one who proved them all magnificently, quietly wrong.